Will Smith. The man who made the world laugh, who conquered Hollywood with a smile that hid a storm. Behind every triumph was a wound behind every applause, a silence he could never escape. This isn't the story of fame. It's the story of a boy who turned pain into light, fell before millions, and rose again as something far greater. A man who finally found peace. Before the applause, before the cameras, before the Oscars, there was silence. A silence so heavy, it carved a boy into two people. The one who smiled for the world, and the one who stood frozen in a living room, watching his father's rage shatter the air. That night, when a moment of violence shattered the air, young Will Smith's heart learned something it would never forget: that strength could destroy, and silence could protect. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just froze. That stillness became his first armor. In that moment, he made a vow only a child could make: to never let his mother see pain again, to never let the world see his weakness. But promises made in fear become ghosts that follow forever. Years later, on the biggest stage on earth, that ghost would return in front of millions. The blow that once silenced him would echo again, this time through his own hand, through a man who had spent a lifetime running from the boy who stood in that living room. Behind every smile we see on screen lies a storm we never knew existed. For Will, that storm began in a house filled with music discipline and buried anger. His father, a man of pride and precision, taught him to work, to build, to stand tall, but also unintentionally to suppress every tear. His mother taught him intellect and grace, but no one taught him what to do with pain. The night she fell, Will's world fractured. But out of that fracture came a strange kind of power, the performer's instinct to fix the world by making it laugh. The audience would become his therapy, the stage his confession booth, the spotlight his salvation. He would become the man who turned trauma into timing, sadness into rhythm. Yet the truth was simpler and sadder. He was still trying to protect his mother by protecting everyone else from hurt, even at the cost of his own peace. Fame would magnify the wound, not heal it. The laughter he created for others could never drown out the memory of that silence. And though decades would pass through chart-topping songs, global fame, and Oscar gold that first blow, the one before the applause would remain the invisible thread tying every triumph to a hidden sorrow. Will Smith's smile could light up a room, but it wasn't born from joy. It was born from survival. In the neighborhood streets of West Philadelphia, where pride was armor and laughter was currency, Will learned early that smiling could change the temperature of a room faster than anger ever could. It was his way of disarming danger, of taking control in chaos. When the world got tense, Will smiled. When his heart broke, he smiled harder. It wasn't denial, it was defense. As a boy, he found that humor could shift reality. If he could make his mother laugh, maybe she'd forget the bruises. If he could make his classmates laugh, maybe they wouldn't notice the fear in his eyes. Every joke was a lifeline. Every laugh a small victory against the darkness. The child who couldn't stop his father's violence discovered he could stop tears not by fighting, but by performing. That became his power. By his teenage years, Will was no longer just funny, he was magnetic. His quick wit, sharp timing, and natural rhythm made him the life of every party. Music became the next step in his escape. When he picked up a microphone and started rapping, the smile turned into a mask of confidence. The Fresh Prince was born a character made of swagger, charm, and perfect rhythm. A version of Will that could conquer any room, any crowd, any fear. But what no one saw was the cost. Every smile hid exhaustion. Every punchline was a shield against memories that still haunted him at night. Behind the stage lights, He wasn't the Fresh Prince, he was still that boy in the living room, desperate to keep the world from falling apart again. That smile, though, carried him to places he could only dream of. It caught the attention of producers' TV networks and millions of fans who saw in him what they wanted to be: fearless, funny, untouchable. Yet the truth was, the smile didn't save him from pain. It simply postponed it. He learned that if he could make the world laugh, maybe he wouldn't have to face his own sadness. But sadness doesn't disappear. It waits. Years later, as his fame grew and his image solidified into one of the most beloved stars in America, Will would look in the mirror and wonder who was smiling back at him. The man. Or the mask. For the longest time, he didn't know. But that confusion was what kept him moving, always working, always performing, always smiling. Because stopping meant silence, and silence meant remembering. The smile that saved him once would later imprison him, a symbol of everything he gave to the world and everything he hid from himself. But before he could learn to be real again, he had to lose everything that made the mask shine. When the lights of the stage first hit his face, Will Smith was already broke. The Fresh Prince, the golden boy of early hip-hop, had fallen from grace before the world even knew his name. At just 20, he had tasted fame, wealth, and the illusion of permanence. Then came the IRS. Then came the silence. Overnight, the young star who filled arenas couldn't even pay rent. His friends were gone, his fortune erased, and for the first time since childhood, the smile didn't work. But when everything fell apart, something inside him refused to stay down. He wasn't done. He couldn't be. Failure wasn't the ending. It was rehearsal for the comeback. He began showing up anywhere people would listen. Parties, studios, casting calls. He met Quincy Jones by chance, a meeting that would change everything. Jones didn't just see a broke rapper. He saw a performer waiting for his second act. Within days, Will found himself standing in front of television cameras, reading lines that didn't yet belong to him. Lines that would soon define a generation. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air wasn't just a sitcom. It was rebirth. The story of a kid from West Philly who gets a second chance mirrored his own life perfectly. Millions laughed at his jokes, sang his theme song, and saw him as pure joy. But behind that joy was desperation. A man trying to rebuild himself line by line, scene by scene. He wasn't acting. He was surviving. Hollywood hadn't expected much. He wasn't trained, he wasn't polished, and he wasn't supposed to last. Yet week after week, Will delivered something rare: authenticity wrapped in laughter. He turned the pain of his past into rhythm, his fear into timing. He became the heartbeat of an era when television still dared to be warm. In living rooms across America, families, black, white, rich, poor, all found something familiar in his charm. By the time The Fresh Prince ended, Will Smith was no longer just a TV star. He was a symbol of resilience. The industry saw it too. Offers poured in, but this time it wasn't about luck. It was about purpose. Will had turned a tax debt and humiliation into the foundation of a career that would rewrite Hollywood's rules. He was the rapper who became an actor, the actor who became a phenomenon, the man who proved that the fall doesn't matter as long as you rise differently. But even as he stood on top, smiling for the cameras, the fear that had built his success still whispered inside him. If you stop performing, they'll stop loving you. That voice, the echo of that living room silence, would follow him into every set, every script, every success. The world saw a man rising. Will knew he was still running. By the mid-1990s, Will Smith was no longer just a name, he was an empire. Every poster, every billboard, Every summer blockbuster seemed to orbit around his grin and unshakable energy. Independence Day turned him into a hero who saved the planet. Men in Black made him the cool face of an entire generation. Hollywood crowned him Mr. July, the king of the box office, the man who could sell out theaters with just a smile. But what the world didn't see was that each success came with a new layer of exhaustion. Behind the glamour, Getzel was burning from within. To stay on top meant never showing weakness, never slowing down, never admitting that the applause couldn't fill the emptiness that followed when the cameras stopped. He was living in the dream everyone wanted and slowly losing the man he used to be. The pressure to perform was relentless. Every role had to be bigger, every laugh louder, every stunt grander. He wasn't competing with anyone else. He was competing with the myth of Will Smith. Fame is a crown forged in fire, and it burns whoever wears it too long. At premieres, interviews, and award shows, his charm never cracked. But in quiet moments, he'd stare at the mirror and ask, "Who am I?" When no one's watching, Hollywood has a way of rewarding masks. The bigger the smile, the more they pay. But Will had always been the boy who believed he could fix the world through laughter, and now the world expected him to. He became the protector again, not of his mother this time, but of millions of strangers who looked to him for hope, fun, and escape. He carried that weight with pride, but also with fear. The roles kept coming: pilots, cops, lovers, legends. Yet with every triumph, the voice inside grew louder. "You can't stop. You can't fail. If you fall, they'll see who you really are." That voice pushed him through the nights of filming, through stunts that broke bones and scenes that drained his soul. But the crown was heavy. He couldn't take it off because he didn't know who he was without it. There's a strange loneliness in being loved by everyone, but known by no one. Will was adored by millions, but very few truly saw him. Behind the laughter, there was fatigue. Behind the confidence, a quiet question: had he built a kingdom or a cage? By the time Men in Black 2 and Bad Boys 2 exploded at the box office, Will Smith was untouchable, yet more fragile than ever. The man who once performed to survive was now surviving to perform. And the higher he climbed, the less he recognized the ground beneath him. Fame had crowned him, but the fire that forged that crown had already begun to burn his peace away. When Will Smith agreed to play Muhammad Ali, he wasn't just accepting a role, he was stepping into the shadow of a god. Ali wasn't a character. He was a force of nature, a man whose courage and conviction shaped an era. To portray him was to invite the weight of history onto his shoulders. And Will, still chasing perfection, didn't hesitate. He wanted greatness, but he didn't yet understand its cost. Training for Ali consumed him. He gained nearly 30 pounds of muscle, sparred for hours each day, studied every interview, every movement, every flicker in the champion's eyes. He didn't just mimic Ali, he became him. He walked like him, spoke like him, thought like him. He carried the swagger, the poetry, and the pain. But method acting has a price, when your own soul is still bleeding. Will lost sleep. He lost balance. He began to question not just how to play Ali, but how to be Will Smith again. Portraying a man who refused to bow to fear, to government, to hate, forced Will to face his own buried truths. Ali's defiance unearthed something long suppressed: Will's fear of confrontation. His lifelong instinct to keep peace, to avoid violence, to please everyone. The irony was cruel. To embody a fighter, he had to face the coward he believed lived inside him, the boy who never stopped his father's fists. Every punch on set became a form of penance. Each blow was a confession, a dialogue between the man he admired and the man he wished to be. The physical exhaustion was brutal. But the emotional toll was worse. For the first time, Will couldn't smile his way through the pain. The laughter that once saved him fell silent. When Ali premiered, critics praised his transformation. Audiences were moved. Yet behind the standing ovations, Will felt hollow. He had poured everything into the role, hoping that by becoming Ali, he would finally feel strong. Instead, he felt lost. He had lived someone else's courage, but still couldn't find his own. It was then he realized that becoming someone great on screen doesn't make you whole off screen. He had reached the peak of artistic respect, but at home, the distance between him and his true self grew wider. The applause faded, and all that remained was fatigue. Years later, Will would say that Ali changed him forever, not because of fame or awards, but because it forced him to confront the question he had avoided his whole life. What does it mean to fight for yourself, not just for others? The man behind Ali wasn't invincible. He was vulnerable, flawed human. But for the first time, Will understood that being broken didn't make him weak. It made him real. When The Pursuit of Happiness came to Will Smith, it wasn't just another movie script, it was a mirror. The story of a struggling father and his little boy sleeping in shelters, holding on to hope through hunger and humiliation, pierced him deeper than any blockbuster ever could. It wasn't acting, it was remembering. The first time he read the line, "You gotta dream, you gotta protect it," he froze. That wasn't just a line for the film, it was a message from the boy he used to be. The one who had stood helpless while his mother cried. The one who promised himself that his children would never know that kind of fear. Filming those scenes with his real son, Jaden, blurred every boundary between fiction and life. The night they shot the scene in the subway bathroom, Will held Jaden in his arms as the door banged from the outside, and tears fell that weren't scripted. They came from a lifetime of guilt, love, and redemption. He wasn't just portraying a father. He was becoming the one he had always wanted to be. The Pursuit of Happiness wasn't about money or success. It was about the dignity of persistence, about how love can survive when everything else collapses. For Will, it was also about forgiveness, forgiving his father, forgiving the silence of his childhood, forgiving himself for all the times he wasn't enough. Behind the camera, the pressure was immense. Hollywood still saw him as the action hero, the smiling savior. But this time, Will didn't want to save the world, he wanted to tell the truth. He stripped away the glamour, the coolness, the swagger. What remained was a man exhausted from pretending, a man ready to show his scars. When the movie premiered, audiences around the world cried with him. They saw themselves in his struggle. Parents, dreamers, people who had fallen and gotten back up. For once, Will didn't have to hide behind charisma. His vulnerability became his strength. The performance earned him an Oscar nomination, but more importantly, it gave him peace. In interviews, he said that playing Chris Gardner redefined success for him. Success wasn't the mansion, the awards, or the fame. It was the moment you can look at your child and know you kept your promise, that you broke the cycle, that you turned pain into protection. For Will Smith, The Pursuit of Happiness wasn't just a movie, it was closure. The boy who once swore to protect his mother had finally learned how to protect his own children. Not through silence, but through love. It was the most honest performance of his life. And deep down, he knew he hadn't just played a father on screen. He had finally become one. For a man who had conquered every corner of Hollywood, Will Smith's biggest battles weren't with critics, they were with time. Every yes he gave to a project came with 1,000 invisible no's to other paths, other possibilities, other versions of the life he might have lived. And the older he grew, the more those ghosts began to whisper. He turned down The Matrix. He turned down Django Unchained. He turned down films that would later define cinema. At the time, it felt logical. The roles didn't fit. The scripts seemed strange. The timing wasn't right. But years later, as he watched Keanu Reeves slow motion through Destiny and Jamie Foxx ride through Vengeance, the what-ifs began to ache. Not with jealousy, but with reflection. For a man who always sought control, regret was the one thing he couldn't edit. Hollywood rarely gives second chances to the same story. And yet, even as Will kept breaking box office records, something inside him wondered if he had been too careful, too polished, too afraid to fail publicly. His career had become a masterpiece of safety, a golden cage lined with billion-dollar success. But art doesn't breathe in safety. It breathes in risk. And for a man who once built his life on laughter, he was starting to realize how often that laughter had kept him from feeling the full weight of his own soul. Each missed role became a mirror, not of failure, but of fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of losing the love of the crowd. Behind every decision, there was still that boy who wanted everyone to be okay, even if it meant silencing himself again. The people saw discipline. He saw distance. They saw perfection. He saw paralysis. Regret is strange. It doesn't scream. It hums quietly like static behind applause. Will carried his regrets like invisible trophies. They reminded him of his humanity. He began to talk about them openly, not as shame, but as truth. In one interview, he said, "I didn't want to be the guy who makes people uncomfortable." That confession said it all. He had spent a lifetime building comfort for others and forgotten the discomfort that made him real. But regret can also be a teacher. It told him that being great isn't about never missing. It's about daring again after you do. And as his children grew, as fame shifted, as Hollywood evolved, Will began to crave something deeper than stardom authenticity. He realized that sometimes the most important roles are the ones you never play, because they teach you what truly matters. The Matrix, Django. All the films that slipped away weren't lost chapters. They were reminders that even legends have limits. And perhaps that's what makes them human. When Will Smith won the Oscar for King Richard, the world called it his moment of redemption, the crowning achievement of a career that had defined generations. On that night, under the golden light of the Dolby Theater, he stood tall, tears streaming down his face, holding the statue that symbolized everything he'd ever worked for. The room rose to its feet. Cameras flashed. Applause thundered. It was supposed to be perfect, but perfection is never peace. Inside, Will was trembling. The role of Richard Williams, the relentless, complex father who raised Venus and Serena, had cut too close. It was not just a performance. It was a reflection of himself, of his own hunger to protect, to guide, to control. In Richard, he saw the man he feared becoming, and the father he desperately wanted to be. Every scene had forced him to wrestle with that duality, strength as love and love as control. Winning the Oscar should have been a victory lap. Instead, it felt like the end of something. Because beneath the applause was exhaustion. Decades of pretending, of performing, of carrying the weight of always being the good guy. For 30 years, Will had smiled through pain, worked through heartbreak, and turned every scar into a punchline. But that night, under the blinding spotlight, the mask was slipping. As he stood on stage, tears still on his face, something inside him broke. The applause faded into a ringing silence. The boy who once promised to protect his mother had spent a lifetime protecting his image. And in that moment, he wasn't sure which one mattered anymore. The irony of King Richard was cruel. The film celebrated a man who fought to give his daughters everything yet lost himself in the process. Will understood that too well. The line between devotion and obsession had blurred in his own life, in his work, his marriage, his fatherhood. He had won the highest honor in cinema, but his soul was tired. The crown, once so desired, now felt like a burden he didn't know how to put down. Fame, once thrilling, had become a cycle of noise. Movies, awards, applause. They were all echoes of something he couldn't feel anymore. He was surrounded by love, yet lonelier than ever. And for the first time, Will began to see that success, when chased without rest, can become another form of prison. That night, when the cameras turned off and the room emptied, he sat in the quiet and stared at the Oscar in his hand. It gleamed under the soft light, cold, perfect, unfeeling. He whispered to himself, not as a star, but as a man who had climbed every mountain only to find silence at the top. What now? Because no matter how high he went, peace was still somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, somewhere he had never dared to go. It happened in seconds, one of those moments that change everything, the kind that divides a life into before and after. The world watched as Will Smith, the smiling symbol of charm and control, walked onto the Oscars stage and did something no one expected. A single act fueled not by hatred, but by something far more dangerous: years of unspoken pain. The incident on that night, nor insult nor fame. It was the collision of decades, the child who couldn't defend his mother, the man who never allowed himself to be angry, the father who vowed to protect all, meeting in one unbearable instant. It wasn't rage that moved him. It was memory. The sound of that impact echoed far beyond the theater. The applause stopped. The world froze. And in that silence, the myth of Will Smith shattered. For the first time in his career, his smile failed him. He didn't know who to be. The man who spent a lifetime controlling every narrative suddenly lost the one thing he valued most: the trust of the world. It wasn't just a scandal. It was an identity crisis broadcast live. The boy who once stood in that quiet living room watching violence unfold had just become what he feared most. People talked about the slap, dissected it, mocked it, condemned it. But few saw what it truly was: a public unraveling of a man who had never learned how to let himself break in private. For years, Will had carried his trauma like armor. He turned fear into charm, shame into success, control into comfort. But armor, when worn too long, starts to crack from within. That night, under the brightest lights in Hollywood, it finally split open. He sat back down after the slap, eyes trembling, jaw locked, tears forming. The cameras caught every second. The world's laughter turned to disbelief. The sound of that silence, heavier than any applause he'd ever received, followed him off stage and into the deepest valley of his life. The night the world went silent was not the night Will Smith fell. It was the night he finally stopped pretending he was unbreakable. For the first time since childhood, he didn't know how to process the storm inside: the anger, the regret, the confusion. The man who had always spoken through laughter now had nothing left to say. And in that silence, something began to shift. Because sometimes you have to lose the world's love to learn how to love yourself. When the lights went out and the crowd dispersed, Will Smith was left alone with the echo not of applause, but of shame. It followed him everywhere, in headlines, in whispers, in the hollow silence of rooms that once roared with laughter. For the first time in his career, no one wanted his performance. They wanted his explanation. But Will didn't have one. He disappeared from public view, retreating from the noise, from the questions, from the mirror. For a man who had lived his entire life in motion, stillness was terrifying. Without scripts, stages, or cameras, he was forced to face the one person he'd spent decades avoiding himself. The guilt came first, sharp and unrelenting. Then came the grief for the man he thought he was, for the people he hurt. For the years he had spent wearing a mask so convincing that even he believed it. The shame didn't come from being condemned. It came from knowing he had broken the very vow that defined his life, never to let anger or harm take over. He had built an empire on charm, on control, on grace, and one moment of raw emotion tore it apart. But shame, like pain, can be a teacher. In the months that followed, Will began to write again. Not for fame, not for art, but to survive. He filled notebooks with confessions, questions, memories. He wrote about fear, about love, about the invisible wounds men carry because they're told not to cry. He stopped running from the silence and started listening to it. And somewhere in that stillness, he began to understand what had really broken inside him that night. Not his career, but his illusion of perfection. He met with therapists, spiritual teachers, and old friends who weren't afraid to tell him the truth. Some forgave him. Some didn't. But forgiveness was never the point. Healing was. He learned that remorse without reflection is just guilt, and guilt without growth is just another prison. Slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild. Social media called him names, talk shows mocked him, and even fans turned away. Yet Will didn't fight back. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. For once, he chose silence, not the silence of fear, but of acceptance. He let the world say what it needed to say, and in doing so, he began to rediscover his own voice. Love had always been both Will Smith's sanctuary and his battlefield. He spoke of it with passion, wrote about it with honesty, and lived it with reckless intensity. Yet behind every grand gesture and romantic vow was a deeper truth that love for him had always been an attempt to heal something broken inside. He wasn't searching for a partner. He was searching for peace. His first marriage taught him pain. It ended not in rage, but in exhaustion, the quiet death of two people who loved each other but couldn't outrun their own wounds. Divorce wasn't just heartbreak. It was humiliation for a man who had built his identity on keeping things together. The public saw another celebrity split. Will saw failure. The echo of the same helplessness he'd felt as a child watching his parents' love collapse under anger. Then came Jada. Fierce, magnetic, spiritual, she challenged everything about him. She didn't just see his charm. She saw the armor beneath it. For a while, she became his reflection, the one person who could match his intensity and still stand her ground. Their love was never quiet. It was a collision of two worlds, two egos, two souls trying to save each other from themselves. They built a family, a brand, and what looked from the outside like a perfect union. But perfection was an illusion. Behind the walls of their mansion, their marriage became something else, a mirror of fire. Love that heals can also burn. They fought, broke, rebuilt, and tried again. They explored unconventional paths, searching for freedom in honesty, for connection beyond possession. But love without boundaries can become confusion, and the more they tried to redefine it, the more it redefined them. Will once said, "We came together young and were both broken in our own ways." That admission carried more weight than most realized. Both of them were warriors of survival, and survival often confuses pain for passion. Their bond was deep but turbulent, full of lessons that came wrapped in hurt. Public opinion turned their marriage into spectacle. Every interview, every confession became a headline, every silence a rumor. Yet through it all, They never stopped being each other's mirror, sometimes reflecting beauty, sometimes reflecting wounds. Love for them wasn't a fairy tale. It was a forge and fire, no matter how holy, always leaves scars. Will's journey through love wasn't about loss or victory. It was about awakening. He learned that you can't rescue someone else if you haven't learned to rescue yourself first. That no amount of devotion can fill the emptiness you refuse to face. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop pretending everything is okay. Fatherhood didn't come to Will Smith as a title, it came as a reckoning. For most of his life, he had been running from one ghost, the image of his father's fists, the sound of his mother's tears. He swore he would never be that man, never make his children feel fear. Yet for years, he feared that his own ambition, his own need for control might turn him into the very thing he hated. His first son, Trey, bore the weight of those early fears. After his first marriage ended, Will became obsessed with not failing again. But love built on guilt is fragile. He tried to overcompensate gifts, time promises, yet the distance lingered. There were awkward silences, unspoken resentments, and moments when he realized that being physically present wasn't the same as being emotionally there. It took years and countless conversations for him to rebuild what had once been broken. Today, Trey calls him not just dad, but friend. It wasn't fame that earned that word. It was humility. Then came Jaden and Willow. Their arrival rewrote his understanding of love entirely. For the first time, Will didn't want to protect his children from pain. He wanted to teach them how to face it. They were wild, creative, unfiltered, and fearless in ways he never was. Watching them grow was both pride and panic. They didn't just inherit his talent, they inherited his restlessness. They were mirrors, showing him both his brilliance and his flaws. When Jaden began acting, Will saw himself in every frame. He wanted to guide him, to shield him from the world's cruelty, to engineer his success. But when After Earth failed, and the criticism fell hardest on his son Will, realized the truth he had been trying to live through him. That failure broke his heart, but it also broke the illusion that love meant control. It taught him that sometimes the best thing a father can do is let his child walk their own path, even if it leads through pain. With Willow, it was different. Her spirit was untamed, her voice powerful. When she wanted to quit her music tour as a child, Will didn't understand. He pushed her, believing discipline was love. She pushed back harder. Her rebellion wasn't disrespect. It was a cry for space, for authenticity, for her father to see her not as a project, but as a person. When she shaved her head in defiance, Will said it felt like someone cut through his pride, but also his blindness. That day, he finally saw her. Fatherhood for Will became redemption, not through perfection, but through surrender. He stopped trying to fix everything and started to listen. He learned that love isn't control, that presence isn't performance, and that apology is one of the most powerful gifts a father can give. There comes a moment in every man's life when the body whispers what the ego refuses to hear, that time is not infinite. For Will Smith, that whisper came during a routine medical checkup when doctors discovered a health scare during a medical checkup. For a man who had lived like a superhero, running through explosions, saving worlds, outrunning pain, it was a reminder that even legends are made of flesh and fear. Lying on that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that hummed with quiet precision, Will realized that for all his success, he had never truly learned how to sit still with his own vulnerability. He had battled studios' critics' expectations, but never mortality. When the doctors spoke of risk of surgery, of what might come next, he felt something he hadn't felt since childhood helplessness. And yet there was also a strange peace in that surrender. After the surgery, recovery forced him into a slower rhythm. The man who once filled every hour with noise interviews, film sets, public appearances was suddenly left with silence. No cameras, no scripts, no applause, just time. Time to think, to feel, to question. For the first time, Will faced not the fear of failure, but the fear of being forgotten. What remains when the fame fades, when the lights dim, when even the strongest body begins to falter? That question haunted him, but it also freed him. He began to document his journey not as a celebrity, but as a human being learning to live without pretending. He spoke openly about fear, about diet, about mental health. He made a YouTube series not to entertain, but to be honest about aging, about self-discipline, about mortality. Millions watched not for perfection, but for truth. The experience stripped away what was left of his invincibility. He learned to treat his body not as a weapon, but as a home, fragile, temporary, sacred. The gym, once a battlefield for ego, became a space of gratitude. Meditation replaced competition. Laughter replaced pressure. He stopped asking what he needed to prove and started asking what he needed to heal. Mortality taught Will what fame never could, that the goal isn't to live forever, but to live fully. It made him gentler, quieter, more deliberate. He began to find beauty in small things, breakfast with family, sunlight on his balcony, moments when no one was watching. There are wounds that silence you, and there are wounds that sing. For Will Smith, music had always been the place where his pain learned to speak. Long before the fame, before the box office, before the Oscars, there was rhythm. There was a boy using rhyme to make sense of chaos. Decades later, after everything he had lived through, the triumphs, the shame, the reckoning, he returned to that same place. But this time, it wasn't about chart toppers or trophies. It was about truth. He began to write again, not for radio, not for profit, but for peace. The songs that emerged were raw, stripped of ego and glitter. He called the collection Beautiful Scars. Each track was a confession, a meditation on the cost of survival. Gone were the party anthems and polished hooks. In their place came verses about forgiveness, fear, and the strange beauty of pain endured. In those lyrics, he faced his younger self, the boy who froze in fear, the man who slapped in silence, the father who tried too hard, the husband who lost his way. Each song was a conversation between who he had been and who he was becoming. The melodies were quiet, but honest, the kind that don't demand attention, but earn it. He said, "I'm not writing music to be understood anymore. I'm writing to understand myself." When snippets of the songs began to circulate online, fans were shocked. This wasn't the Will Smith of summer blockbusters or red carpets. This was a man finally at peace with imperfection. One track opened with a line that captured his entire journey. "These scars ain't ugly. They're proof I made it through." It was more than lyricism. It was revelation. In creating Beautiful Scars, Will rediscovered the purpose of art not to escape life, but to illuminate it. He recorded late into the night, his voice worn but steady. No auto-tune, no effects, just breath, rhythm, and emotion. The same vulnerability that once terrified him now became his power. Critics would later call it the most human work of his career, not because of production, but because of honesty. For the first time, he wasn't performing for applause. He was performing for healing. The music wasn't about who Will Smith was, it was about who he had become. At 56, Will Smith no longer wants to be the fresh prince, the box office king, or the face of perfection. He just wants to be a man, flawed, present, and free. The applause that once fueled him has quieted. The spotlight that once defined him now feels like a guest instead of a master. And in the calm that follows chaos, he has found something he never had before peace. He wakes up early these days, not to chase anything, but to feel the day unfold. The same hands that once threw punches on screen now hold coffee mugs and turn pages in silence. He journals. He meditates. He laughs, not the booming, performative laugh the world remembers, but the kind that comes from stillness, from acceptance. For a man who once believed his worth was measured by how many people were watching, learning to be unseen has been the greatest freedom of all. He's still working, still creating, still inspiring, but the hunger is different now. The drive no longer comes from fear of failure, but from gratitude for the chance to try again. He's learned that legacy isn't built in headlines or awards, but in the small moments that no one records a phone call. To a son, a quiet dinner with family, a moment of kindness to a stranger. Those are the scenes that define a life. Looking back, Will can see the thread that connects it all. The boy who stayed silent, the man who smiled through pain, the father who tried too hard. The husband who loved imperfectly, the artist who kept searching for truth. Every version of him was necessary to reach this one. The mistakes weren't stains, they were maps. Each one led him closer to who he was always meant to be. He no longer runs from the past. He embraces it, the laughter, the shame, the victories, the losses, because all of it is him. And maybe that's what true redemption looks like, not erasing who you were, but learning to love that person anyway. There are no crowns left to wear, no roles left to play. Just life, raw, unpredictable, beautiful. The man who once tried to save the world has learned that saving yourself is the hardest and most heroic act of all. Because in the end, he was never just the Fresh Prince or a king of Hollywood. He was and is something far greater, a reminder that we can all fall and rise again and still be worthy of love. If this story touched your heart, let the world know. Hit like, quite to help more people discover it. Comment your favorite moment from Will's journey and subscribe to USA Legends Never Fade, where every week we uncover the real stories behind the legends. Because heroes fade on screen, but their humanity never does.